The tales of Caesarius of Heisterbach, of clerks who were singing in a spirit of pride, and whose voices the devil put into a sack. Once when certain clerks were singing vicariously in a church, that is, loudly and without devotion, and raising on high tumultuous voices, a certain religious, who happened to be present, saw a demon standing in a prominent place, holding a capacious sack in his left hand, and with his right hand widely extended he caught the voices of the singers, and put them into the sack. When the office was over, and they were then congregating each other, as those who had praised God well and heartily, he who had seen the vision said, "You have indeed sung well, but you have sung a sack full." When they wondered and asked him why he said this, he told them the vision. "This I heard from a man of very great authority, an abbot of the Cistercian order." These examples throw no reflection upon hardiness of devotion in praising God in psalm and hymn, but only upon vainglory. How pleasing to him is the uplifting of the voice in devotion! You will hear plainly in the 5th chapter of the next book, and there too you will find how greatly the demons rejoice when the voice is upraised in psalmody without humility. Hear now a very terrible instance of preaching with a view to praise and gain. Of a priest who had taken the cross, and whom the devil attacked after a sermon, had been delivered by a certain preacher of the cross. Chapter 10. When Oliver, the scholastic of Cologne, mentioned in the 2nd book, was preaching the cross in Bruges and Ghent, cities of Flanders, a priest named Siger, wearing a religious dress and having a cross on the breast of his cassock like a Templar, introduced himself to Brother Bernard, our fellow monk, who was then the assistant preacher and a colleague of Oliver. This man was of handsome face and imposing presence, and very eloquent in his own dialect. He offered Bernard a gem of many colors, and said that he had brought it from Ghetto, and that it was of such virtue as to bring success to any who wore it. But Bernard said, "Sir, I must decline your gifts. You will soon discover if I can help you with the master in any way within reason," for it seemed to be his desire to get authority from Oliver to preach. And the same day permission was given him to address the people. On the following day, after Bernard, at the station next appointed, had preached a moving sermon to the crowd. As soon as the sermon was over, Siger, who was then present, fell headlong into the crowd, with contortions of the body as if one possessed, as indeed he was. Master Oliver, coming up immediately with his clerks, made the sign of the cross over the man, and had him carried into the church, and laid before the altar, where the poor wretch poured forth a stream of blasphemies and horrible words against God and against Oliver himself. Then he was fastened to a cart with straps and sent to his friends, and it said that the devil carried him off on the 5th day in accordance with the previous threat. Now from this man's obsession and death, we can see that his preaching was not for the sake of devotion, but rather of ambition. He is said also to have an apostate, and in some way to have obtained letters from the Lord Pope, allowing him to enter the province. Others said that he had been in the excommunicated ship which carried arms to sell to the Saracens in Ceuta. The novice replies, "It astonishes me that the Lord should punish contempt so severely in this man, while there are so many priests today who handled most unworthily the sacred mysteries of Christ, and only preach at their convenience." The monk replied, "I think he was made an example for other priests, both that they should not trouble that pure preaching of the cross which has been done only in honor of Christ, and also because of the merits of Oliver. How severely at that time Christ punished deceits and insults cast upon him in his preachers. You have an example in the 7th chapter of the 2nd book concerning Gottschalk, the usurer, who cunningly cheated the Pope's dispensator. You will also have another in the next chapter about an old, pride-ridden woman who jeered at Master Arnold, Oliver's disciple, when he was preaching. Of a knight whose son was killed by a thunderbolt, because the father had blasphemed against the bad weather. Chapter 21. 5 years ago, at the time of those violent thunderstorms, when the harvest was hindered by almost daily rains, a certain knight of our province who lived in a township very near to us, when he saw the sky in the west growing dark with rain clouds, said angrily, "See, here comes the devil again." Scarcely had he uttered the words when, behold, a thunderbolt struck his little son on his nurse's lap without injuring the woman. And further, for that blasphemy he was afflicted in another of his possessions, both in buildings and cattle, that he might learn for the future not to blaspheme. This happened at the same time that our farm near the town of Castle was struck by lightning. From this it is clear how foolish it is for a mortal man, who is but dust and ashes, to stretch forth his mouth unto the heavens. See how anger produces ill consequences, not only like this, but of countless other kinds. The novice replies, "If in this life God punishes so terribly the sin of anger, surely in the life to come he will grievously afflict the slaves of this vice." The monk says, "You will learn this in the following chapter." Of a shrewish maiden who was buried with consumed by fire from the waist upwards. Chapter 22. The bailiff of a neighboring town called Winter told me a very terrible story. Not long ago, he said, a monk, a stranger in these parts, was in our church at Mass, and near him were some fashionable matrons, the wives of certain knights, whose empty chatter interfered very much with his prayers. When the Mass was over, he drew some of these knights aside and said to them, "Sirs, I came to this church to pray, but the devil prompted these ladies to make such chattering and whispering round me that I could not pray at all. I should like to tell you a terrible story of what happened in my own time and in my own town. There was a certain high-born maiden, the daughter of wealthy parents, who had so violent a temper and was such a quarrelsome scold that wherever she was, whether at home or in church, there she stirred up quarrels and revived old enmities, so that when he could escape the scourge of her tongue, thought himself a happy man. At last she died and was buried in the parvis of the church. When we came to the church the next morning, we saw that her tomb was emitting smoke like a furnace. Terrified at this and eager to discover what it meant, we threw out the earth, and behold, the upper part of her body was consumed by fire, while the lower part from the waist downwards was seen to be untouched. The novice asked, "What did this signify?" The monk replied, "I agree with what was said by those who had known her life. God willed to show in her body that he was pleased with her virtue of chastity, and that he abhors her vice of ill temper. Because she was a virgin, the lower part of her body was preserved uninjured for the sake of her chastity. But because she was so prone to anger, her heart, her liver, her tongue, her hands, and all the adjacent parts were devoured by fire. For anger is fire." The novice says, "What you say so terrifies me, that I purpose never again to lose my temper with my brethren." The monk said, "Then you will be happy." Of a monk who, being accused by the envy of another, was imprisoned and gloriously delivered. Chapter 24. Not long ago, a certain monk, attacked and conquered by the pangs of envy, accused one of the younger brethren before the abbot, imputing him to very foul crimes. Now when the abbot did not believe him, he reserved his accusation for a great punishment when the visitor should come. What need of more? The guile of the envious monk had so great weight with this great visitor that in the presence of them all at the chapter, he threw in the teeth of this youth all the vices that had been reported to him. And when the young man denied them and called God to witness his innocence, he refused to believe him and ordered him to be thrown into prison in a scanty robe. After the departure of the visitor, the justice of God struck down the envious accuser with a sudden sickness, and fearing death was at hand, he confessed that he had accused him falsely through envy. And when by his confessor's advice he had made this clear to the elders, the truth was immediately conveyed to the visitor, who returned at once in consternation to the monastery, went to the prison, and prostrate at the feet of the monk, begged his forgiveness, because he had sinned against him in ignorance, and afterwards brought him out of great honor, giving no heed to his modest reluctance. All this was told to me by an abbot who was present at that visitation. The novice asked, "Surely that monk earned great merit under so heavy a trial?" The monk said, "That trial was to him what the furnace is to the gold, the fire to the iron, the flail to the grain, the winepress to the grape, for he kept his patience in tribulation. To the envious monk, his envy was a poison to the stomach, as the moth to clothing, as blight to the flower, or as consumption to the body." The novice says, "If you know of any further examples of temptation by envy, I pray you tell me them." The monk said, "Because envy is a hidden disease, no examples occur to me at present, which is either worthy to be remembered or necessary for edification. Nevertheless, I will tell you of a certain meritorious envy, which you will be pleased to hear. Of a lay brother who, in despair, drowned himself in a fish pond. It is scarcely 3 years ago since excess of melancholy brought final despair upon a certain lay brother. In speaking or writing of these terrible tragedies, I am unwilling to mention the names of places or persons, or to hint at the order involved, lest I should seem to be casting reflection upon any of my fellow religious. This brother was well known to me. From his youth to old age, he had lived both respected and liked by all his brethren, so that none in all the order seemed stricter than he in the observance of the rule, or more endowed with virtues. Seldom would he speak, and seldom use the accustomed relaxations of the rule. Yet by some incomprehensible judgment of God, he grew so melancholy and cast down that he became completely obsessed with fear of his sins, and altogether despairing of eternal life. It was not that he was troubled with any lack of faith, but rather that he lost all hope of salvation. By no authority of Scripture could he be lifted up, by no examples be restored to hope of pardon, though it is believed that he had never been a great sinner. When his brethren asked him what it was that he feared, and why he despaired, he would reply, "I cannot say my prayers as I used, and I am so afraid of hell," because he was afflicted with this vice of melancholy, as sin it laid hold of him, and from the two despair was born in his heart. Placed in the infirmary, one morning, having determined upon death, he went to his superior and said, "I cannot fight against God any longer." The other took little heed of his words, but he went away to the fish pond near the monastery, threw himself in, and was drowned. Of a nun who, driven mad by a wicked lay brother, threw herself into a well. A somewhat similar thing took place last year in a convent of nuns. Though the motive was different, I was told by a nun of the same order that one of the sisters was so driven mad by the magic arts of a miserable brother who was clothed in the habit, but not in the spirit of a religious, that she could not endure the temptations that he had put into her heart. She would not tell her trouble to anyone, but only said, "I want to go out. I want to get away, because I am sorry that I ever came here." And when they would not allow her to go, her melancholy increased still more, and when once she found herself alone, she threw herself into the well and died. When they sought her everywhere and could not find her, one of the sisters remembered that she had threatened to drown herself in the well. The well was searched, and she was found there dead. It was almost at the same time that this miserable lay brother by similar wickedness enticed a nun from another convent and corrupted her, and she, poor soul, never came back from the world. Of a young girl who hanged herself from melancholia at finding herself despised by her lover. 13 years ago, when our monks were returning to the Rhine in a barge from the harvest, they came to a hamlet near Cologne called Rodenkirch, and found a young girl lying upon the ground, recently dead. It was said about her that she had given birth to a child by a certain man, and because he had repudiated her, she had taken her life in the violence of her despair. Of a youth who had gambled away his clothes and hanged himself in despair. There was a certain youth at Cologne, some time before this, who had gambled away his clothes and was rendered so miserable by this loss that he went up to the solar of this house and hanged himself. You see how dangerous melancholy is when it is not in accordance with the will of God. Novice asked, "What are we to think of the souls of these?" The monk said, "If the cause be only melancholy and despair, not madness or wandering of the mind, there can be little doubt that they are damned. In the case of those who are mad or weak-minded and whom the power of reason is lost, they are assuredly saved, however they die, if they were in a state of grace before the madness took them." Of the lay brother mentioned above, a wise man who knew him well said this in my hearing. I do not think that he ever made an honest confession. For God, his righteous judgment, may sometimes allow the just who fear him to wander in their senses, yet he will not suffer them to be any so miserable a death.